The summer sun blazed down on the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as thousands of tourists gathered for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Among the crowd stood Marcus Thompson, a 32-year-old American businessman from Chicago, clutching a plastic water bottle and wearing a smirk that would soon disappear forever. Marcus had come to London for what he called a quick European vacation between business deals. He was the type of man who believed money could buy respect, and his expensive clothes and confident swagger showed it. Standing at 6 feet tall with perfectly styled hair and designer sunglasses, he looked every bit the successful American tourist he thought himself to be. The Royal Guard stood motionless in their iconic red uniforms and tall black bearskin hats. Their faces remained expressionless, eyes fixed straight ahead as they had been trained to do for centuries. These weren't just ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were elite fighting men, each with years of military training and combat experience. But to Marcus, they looked like nothing more than living statues put there for his entertainment. "Look at these guys," Marcus whispered loudly to his friend Jake, who had joined him on the trip. "They're like robots. I bet they don't even blink." He pulled out his phone and started recording, moving closer to one particular guard who stood near the entrance. The guard was Sergeant William Hayes, a 28-year-old veteran who had served 2 tours in Afghanistan before joining the prestigious Queen's Guard. His military record was spotless, decorated with commendations for bravery under fire. He had saved 3 fellow soldiers during a Taliban ambush, and had earned the respect of every man in his unit. Standing perfectly still in the summer heat, sweat beading under his heavy uniform, William maintained the discipline that had been drilled into him since basic training. Marcus circled around William like a predator studying its prey. Other tourists watched nervously, sensing that something inappropriate was about to happen. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, pointing at the man with the camera who was getting too close to the guard. "I wonder what it takes to make one of these guys move," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the courtyard. He was clearly enjoying the attention he was getting from other visitors. Some tourists started taking pictures of him, thinking he was part of some kind of performance. William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Years of training had taught him to ignore distractions. But something about this tourist's tone bothered him. It wasn't just curiosity or innocent fun. There was mockery in the man's voice, disrespect that cut deeper than the tourist could possibly understand. The crowd grew larger as word spread that something interesting was happening. Marcus fed off the attention, his confidence growing with each passing minute. He began making exaggerated movements in front of William, waving his hands and making faces trying to get any kind of reaction. "Come on, buddy," Marcus called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Give us a smile. You're supposed to be entertaining the tourists, right?" He laughed at his own joke, looking around for approval from the crowd, but the crowd wasn't laughing. An elderly British gentleman in a worn military jacket stepped forward, his medals catching the sunlight. "Young man," he said firmly, "these guards are soldiers, not entertainers. They deserve your respect." Marcus turned to face the old man, his smile fading into irritation. "Hey, Grandpa, nobody asked for your opinion. I paid good money to come here, and I'll enjoy myself however I want." The dismissive tone in his voice made several people in the crowd shake their heads in disgust. The elderly veteran's face hardened. He had fought in the Falklands War and knew exactly what kind of sacrifice these young guards represented. "That soldier you're mocking has probably seen more courage in one day than you'll see in your entire life," he said quietly. Marcus laughed again, but this time it sounded forced. "Yeah, right. Standing around in a fancy costume is real heroic." He turned back to William, his movements becoming more aggressive and mocking. A tour guide tried to intervene, explaining the history and significance of the Royal Guard to Marcus, but he waved her away dismissively. He was too caught up in his performance to care about tradition or respect. William's training had prepared him for many situations, but dealing with deliberately disrespectful tourists was one of the most challenging parts of his duty. He had to remain professional while representing the crown, even when every instinct told him to respond to the mockery. The temperature climbed higher, and William's heavy uniform felt like a furnace. The bearskin hat, weighing several pounds, seemed to press down harder with each passing minute. But physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional challenge of maintaining dignity while being treated like a circus act. Marcus's friend Jake began to feel uncomfortable with the situation. "Come on, man," he whispered. "Maybe we should just move on. Take some pictures of the castle or something." But Marcus was beyond listening to reason. The attention he was getting from the crowd had inflated his ego to dangerous levels. Other tourists began pulling out their phones, some recording Marcus's behavior with obvious disapproval. A few mothers covered their children's eyes, not wanting them to witness such disrespectful conduct. The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted from curiosity to tension. Security personnel stationed around the castle began moving closer, recognizing that the situation was escalating. They had dealt with difficult tourists before, but something about this man's behavior suggested it might get worse before it got better. Marcus noticed the security guards approaching and seemed to interpret their attention as validation of his importance. He raised his voice even louder, ensuring that everyone in the area could hear him clearly. "I bet this guy would run away crying if he ever faced a real fight," Marcus announced to the crowd, pointing directly at William. "All that fancy uniform can't hide the fact that he's probably never been in real danger." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Several veterans in the crowd looked at each other with expressions of barely controlled anger. They knew something that Marcus didn't, something that would soon change everything. William's hands remained perfectly positioned at his sides, but his breathing had changed slightly. The insult had hit closer to home than Marcus could possibly imagine. Memories of Afghanistan flickered through his mind. Images of fallen comrades and moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The crowd continued to grow, and with it, the tension that would soon explode into something none of them would ever forget. Marcus reached into his backpack and pulled out a second water bottle, this one nearly full. He held it up like a trophy, grinning widely at the crowd that had gathered around him. "Let's see if this tin soldier melts when he gets wet," he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard with cruel confidence. The elderly veteran who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, his weathered face showing barely controlled fury. "Son, you're about to cross a line you can't come back from," he warned, his voice steady but filled with authority that came from decades of military service. Marcus turned to face the old man, his expression mocking. "What line, Grandpa? It's just water. I'm sure these toy soldiers get rained on all the time." He gestured dismissively at William, who continued to stand at perfect attention despite the escalating situation. A woman in the crowd, clearly a local resident familiar with the guard's history, spoke up loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That guard you're about to humiliate served in Afghanistan. He saved the lives of 3 soldiers during a Taliban attack. He earned his position through blood and sacrifice, not through playing dress-up." The information hit the crowd like a wave. Whispered conversations spread through the gathering tourists, and many began looking at Marcus with open disgust. But instead of backing down, Marcus seemed to take the revelation as a personal challenge. "Afghanistan, huh?" Marcus said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, if he's such a war hero, then a little water shouldn't bother him, right?" He unscrewed the cap of his water bottle, the plastic crinkling loudly in the suddenly quiet courtyard. William's training had taught him to expect anything during guard duty. He had dealt with drunk tourists, curious children, and even protesters trying to make political statements. But something about this particular situation felt different. The man's deliberate cruelty, his obvious enjoyment of causing humiliation, triggered memories that William had worked hard to suppress. In Afghanistan, William had learned that sometimes the greatest threats came not from obvious enemies, but from those who showed no respect for honor or sacrifice. He remembered the faces of Taliban fighters who had tortured captured soldiers, not for information, but simply because they enjoyed inflicting suffering on those who couldn't fight back. Marcus raised the water bottle higher, making sure everyone could see what he was about to do. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced like a circus ringmaster, "prepare to witness the melting of a British tin soldier." Jake grabbed his friend's arm desperately. "Marcus, don't do this. You're going to get arrested, and this is just wrong." But Marcus shook him off, his eyes fixed on William with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people, drawn by the commotion and the growing sense that something significant was about to happen. Many held up their phones, recording what they sensed would be a moment that would be talked about for years to come. Among the observers was Mrs. Elizabeth Carter, a 70-year-old woman whose grandson had served alongside William in Afghanistan. She recognized the guard immediately and felt her heart break as she watched the tourist prepare to humiliate him. Her grandson had told her stories about Sergeant Hayes, about his courage under fire and his unwavering commitment to his fellow soldiers. "Please don't do this," Mrs. Carter called out, her voice trembling with emotion. "That young man has already given more for his country than most people give in a lifetime. Haven't you Americans supposed to understand about honoring your veterans?" Marcus glanced at her briefly, but her words seemed to bounce off him like rain off glass. He was too caught up in his performance, too addicted to the attention and the sense of power he felt over someone who couldn't fight back. Security guards had positioned themselves strategically around the courtyard, but they were in a difficult position. The tourist hadn't technically committed a crime yet, and intervening too early might escalate the situation unnecessarily. They watched carefully, ready to move at the first sign of actual assault. William's mind drifted momentarily to a dusty road outside Kabul, where he had first learned the true meaning of duty under pressure. His unit had been ambushed, and while bullets flew around them, he had to make a choice between his own safety and the lives of 3 wounded soldiers. The decision had been automatic, born from the same sense of duty that now kept him standing perfectly still despite the humiliation being heaped upon him. The water bottle felt heavy in Marcus's hand as he positioned it directly above William's head. The summer sun reflected off the plastic, creating small rainbows that danced across the ancient stone walls of the castle. For a moment, the beauty of the scene contrasted sharply with the ugliness of what was about to unfold. "Here we go, everyone," Marcus shouted, tilting the bottle forward. "Let's see what happens when reality meets fantasy." The first drops of water fell slowly, almost in slow motion. They landed on the black fur of William's bearskin hat, creating small dark spots that spread gradually through the thick material. The crowd held its collective breath, some horrified by what they were witnessing, others fascinated by the drama unfolding before them. William felt the cold water seeping through his hat and beginning to drip down his face. His training screamed at him to remain still, to maintain the dignity of his position no matter what happened. But something deeper, something connected to every moment of courage and sacrifice in his military career, began to stir within him. Marcus increased the flow, pouring the water more steadily now. It ran down William's face, mixing with the sweat from the summer heat and the stress of the situation. His red uniform began to show dark patches where the water soaked through the heavy fabric. "Look at him," Marcus laughed, his voice carrying across the courtyard. The mighty British soldier, standing there like a scarecrow in the rain. "This is what passes for military excellence in this country?" The crowd's murmur grew louder and not in Marcus's favor. People began booing, their disapproval clear and growing stronger by the moment. But Marcus was beyond caring about their opinion. He was lost in his own sense of power, drunk on the ability to humiliate someone who represented everything he secretly envied, but would never admit. As the last drops fell from the bottle, something in William's expression began to change. It was subtle at first, invisible to most observers, but those with military experience could see it. The perfect stillness that had defined his posture began to shift into something else entirely. The elderly veteran in the crowd recognized the look immediately. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers who had been pushed beyond their breaking point, who had endured more than any human should have to endure. "Oh no," he whispered to himself. "That boy's about to snap." Marcus stepped back, admiring his handiwork with obvious satisfaction. Water dripped steadily from William's uniform, forming small puddles on the ancient stones beneath his feet. The tourist pulled out his phone to take pictures, wanting to capture the moment of his triumph over the British military. But as he raised his camera, Marcus failed to notice the change that was beginning to occur in William's stance. The rigid discipline of the Royal Guard was giving way to something far more dangerous, something forged in the crucible of real combat and tempered by years of watching good men die for the freedom that Marcus took for granted. The crowd sensed the shift too, even if they couldn't articulate what was happening. The atmosphere in the courtyard had changed from tension to something approaching dread. Everyone seemed to understand instinctively that they were witnessing the calm before a storm that would shake them all to their core. William's eyes, which had remained fixed straight ahead throughout the humiliation, slowly began to move. It started as barely perceptible shift, a microscopic deviation from the perfect military bearing he had maintained. But to those watching closely, it was like watching a dam begin to crack under enormous pressure. Marcus was too busy taking selfies with the soaked guard in the background to notice the change. He posed with exaggerated expressions of triumph, his phone clicking repeatedly as he captured what he thought was his moment of glory. "This is going straight to social media," he announced proudly. "Wait until my friends back home see how I handled these British toy soldiers." The crowd had grown quieter, sensing something ominous in the air. Children pressed closer to their parents, and several tourists began backing away instinctively. The elderly veteran who had tried to warn Marcus earlier moved closer to his wife, his military instincts telling him that the situation was about to explode. Mrs. Carter, the woman whose grandson had served with William, felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She remembered the stories her grandson had told her about Sergeant Hayes, about the night when Taliban fighters had captured and tortured a British patrol. William had volunteered for the rescue mission, walking into almost certain death to bring his comrades home. 3 families still sent him Christmas cards every year because their sons were alive because of his courage. William's breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more controlled. It was the same breathing pattern he had used in Afghanistan when preparing for combat, when the difference between life and death came down to split-second timing and absolute focus. His hands, still positioned perfectly at his sides, had begun to tremble almost imperceptibly. The memories were flooding back now, unstoppable and vivid. He remembered the weight of his wounded comrade on his back as he carried him to safety under enemy fire. He remembered the faces of children in Afghan villages who had looked to British soldiers for protection from the very real monsters that haunted their world. He remembered standing over the grave of his best friend, killed by an improvised explosive device while delivering medical supplies to a remote village. Marcus finished taking his pictures and moved even closer to William. Emboldened by the guard's apparent passivity, "You know what?" he said loudly, addressing the crowd as much as William himself. "I think I'm going to take one of those funny hats as a souvenir. I mean, what's he going to do about it?" The suggestion sent a shockwave through the crowd. Even tourists unfamiliar with British military tradition understood that touching a guard's uniform was absolutely forbidden. Several security personnel began moving closer, but they were still too far away to intervene quickly if Marcus followed through on his threat. Jake grabbed his friend's arm again, his voice urgent with panic. "Marcus, stop this right now. You're going to end up in a British prison, and I'm not bailing you out." But Marcus pushed him away roughly, his eyes fixed on William's bearskin hat with the predatory focus of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. "Relax, Jake," Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge of mania. "What's the worst that could happen? He gets court-martialed for breaking character? These guys are trained to stand there and take whatever the public dishes out." William's jaw tightened as Marcus reached up toward his hat. In that moment, time seemed to slow down. William could see the man's hand approaching his uniform, could smell the alcohol on his breath from lunch, could hear the gasps of horror from the crowd. But more than anything, he could feel the weight of every soldier who had ever stood guard, every warrior who had ever defended something larger than himself. The bearskin hat wasn't just a piece of uniform to William. It represented centuries of British military tradition, worn by men who had died at Waterloo, who had held the line at the Somme, who had stood alone against the Nazi war machine when the rest of Europe had fallen. It represented his fallen comrades in Afghanistan, the 3 men whose lives he had saved, and every moment of courage in the face of impossible odds. As Marcus's fingers made contact with the black fur of the hat, something inside William finally snapped. Not broke exactly, but transformed. The rigid discipline of the ceremonial guard gave way to the lethal reflexes of a combat veteran who had survived some of the most dangerous situations imaginable. William's hand moved with lightning speed, catching Marcus's wrist in a grip that felt like a steel trap. The tourist's eyes widened in shock and pain as he realized that the toy soldier he had been tormenting possessed strength that came from years of real combat training. "Sir," William said, his voice perfectly calm and controlled despite the rage burning in his eyes, "you will remove your hand from my uniform immediately." The crowd erupted in gasps and excited chatter. Many began applauding spontaneously, relieved that someone had finally stood up to the bully who had been tormenting the guard. Security personnel rushed forward, but they slowed their approach when they realized that the situation was under control. Marcus tried to pull his hand away, but William's grip was unyielding. For the first time since the confrontation began, genuine fear flickered across the tourist's face. He had expected the guard to remain passive, to continue playing the role of a living statue no matter what happened. The reality of facing a trained soldier was nothing like what he had imagined. "Let go of me," Marcus demanded, his voice rising in pitch as panic set in. "You can't touch me. I'm an American citizen." He tried to use his free hand to push William away, but the guard didn't budge even slightly. William's grip tightened just enough to make his point clear. "Sir, you are touching the uniform of a Queen's Guard without permission. You have disrespected this uniform, this position, and everything it represents. You will apologize to these people for your behavior, and then you will leave this area immediately." The transformation in William was complete and terrifying. Gone was the passive ceremonial figure, replaced by a soldier who had faced down Taliban fighters and lived to tell about it. His voice carried the authority of someone who had given orders under fire and expected them to be followed without question. Marcus's face had gone pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead. Despite the cooling effect of the water he had poured on himself earlier, he could feel the strength in William's grip, could see the steel in his eyes, and for the first time began to understand that he had pushed the wrong person too far. The crowd had gone completely silent, mesmerized by the dramatic reversal of power. The man who had seemed so confident and in control just moments before now looked small and frightened, his bravado evaporating under the intense gaze of a real soldier. I was just having some fun," Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean anything by it." William's expression didn't change, but his voice grew even colder. "Fun? You think humiliating someone who has served his country is fun? You think mocking the uniform worn by men who have died for your freedom is entertainment?" Security guards finally reached the scene, but they held back, recognizing that the situation was being handled by someone far more qualified than they were. The senior security officer, a former military man himself, nodded approvingly at William's measured response to the provocation. Marcus's friend Jake stood frozen nearby, horrified by what his companion had brought upon himself and ashamed to be associated with such behavior. He had tried to warn Marcus, but now all he could do was watch as his friend faced the consequences of his actions. The elderly veteran in the crowd stepped forward again, but this time his expression showed pride rather than anger. "That's how you handle a bully, son," he called out to William. "Your service honors us all." William acknowledged the comment with a slight nod, but his attention remained focused on Marcus, who was now trembling under the guard's unwavering stare. The tourist had learned too late that there was a vast difference between a ceremonial figure and a combat soldier, and that difference was about to change his life forever. William released Marcus's wrist with deliberate slowness, but his eyes never left the tourist's face. Marcus stumbled backward, clutching his hand against his chest, his fingers already showing red marks where the guard's steel grip had held him. The crowd watched in absolute silence as the dynamic between the two men had completely reversed. "You want to know about real soldiers?" William said, his voice carrying across the courtyard with quiet authority. "Let me tell you about real soldiers, sir." Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but something in William's tone made him close it again. The guard's presence had grown larger somehow, filling the space around him with an intensity that made everyone lean forward to listen. "Real soldiers don't stand here for show," William continued, water still dripping from his uniform. "Real soldiers stand here because we understand sacrifice. Because we've seen what happens when good men and women put themselves between evil and innocent people." The crowd had grown to over 200 people now, drawn by word spreading through the castle that something extraordinary was happening. Among them were several other veterans, their faces showing recognition and respect for what they were witnessing. William's voice grew stronger, carrying the weight of years of experience and loss. 3 years ago, in a valley outside Kabul, I watched my best friend die because he threw himself on a grenade to save a group of Afghan children. His name was Tommy Morrison. He was 26 years old, and he left behind a wife and a baby daughter he never got to meet. Marcus's face had gone completely white. The reality of what he had mocked was beginning to sink in, and the weight of his actions pressed down on him like a physical force. "Tommy would have found your behavior today amusing," William said, taking a step closer to Marcus, who instinctively backed away. He would have laughed and said that freedom means the right to be stupid in public. But I'm not Tommy. I'm the soldier who had to carry his body home to his family. A woman in the crowd began crying openly. Others held their hands over their hearts, moved by the raw emotion in William's words. The atmosphere had shifted completely from entertainment to something approaching a religious experience. You asked what would happen if I faced a real fight, William continued, his voice never rising but somehow becoming more powerful with each word. Let me tell you about real fights, sir. Real fights happen when your convoy hits an improvised explosive device, and you have to pull 3 unconscious men from a burning vehicle while insurgents shoot at you from rooftops. Marcus tried to back away further, but he found himself pressed against other tourists who had formed a circle around the confrontation. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the truth that was being laid bare before him. Real fights happen when you're outnumbered 10-1 in a mud compound, and the only thing standing between a group of Taliban fighters and a village full of families is you and 5 other soldiers with limited ammunition and no backup coming. William's uniform was still soaked, but he stood straighter than ever, transformed by the power of his own memories and the need to defend the honor of every soldier who had ever served. You want to see me cry? William asked, and for the first time emotion cracked his voice slightly. I cried when I had to tell Tommy's wife that her husband wasn't coming home. I cried when I held his baby daughter at his funeral, knowing she would grow up without ever knowing her father. I cried when I visited the families of the other good men we lost. Men who died so that people like you could travel safely around the world and mock soldiers in public. The elderly veteran who had tried to defend William earlier was now openly weeping, his military medals catching the sunlight as his chest heaved with emotion. His wife held onto his arm, understanding that William's words were awakening memories in her husband that had been buried for decades. Marcus looked around desperately, seeking support from the crowd, but found only faces filled with disgust and disappointment. His friend Jake had moved away, ashamed to be associated with him. Even other American tourists in the crowd were shaking their heads, embarrassed by their countrymen's behavior. This uniform, William said, gesturing to his soaked red coat, has been worn by men who died at Normandy, who fought in the trenches of World War I, who stood against Hitler when the rest of the world wasn't sure if freedom would survive. Every thread represents sacrifice that you couldn't begin to understand. Security personnel had formed a protective perimeter around the scene, but they made no move to intervene. Their supervisor, recognizing the historical significance of what was happening, had quietly contacted his superiors to ensure that William wouldn't face disciplinary action for breaking protocol. Mrs. Carter, the woman whose grandson had served with William, pushed through the crowd until she stood at the front. "Sergeant Hayes," she called out, her voice strong despite her tears. "My grandson David Carter served under you in Afghanistan. He told me you saved his life." William's expression softened for a moment as he recognized the name. "David was a good soldier, ma'am. He saved more lives than I ever did. He told me about the night patrol," Mrs. Carter continued, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "He said you went back into enemy territory 3 times to rescue wounded men. He said you carried them out one by one while bullets flew around you." The crowd murmured with amazement and respect. Marcus felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, all reflecting the same message. He had humiliated a genuine hero, and there was no excuse for his behavior. William turned his attention back to Marcus, who was now visibly shaking. "You asked what it takes to make me move," he said quietly. "It takes someone dishonoring the memory of better men than either of us will ever be. It takes someone mocking the sacrifice of soldiers who died so that tourists like you could take safe vacations in free countries." A teenage boy in the crowd raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, are you really a war hero?" he asked in a small voice. William's expression grew thoughtful. "No, son. I'm just a soldier who did his job. The heroes are the ones who didn't come home. The heroes are the families who lost fathers and sons and daughters, and who somehow find the strength to keep believing that their sacrifice meant something." He looked directly at Marcus again, his gaze unwavering. "The question isn't whether I'm a hero. The question is whether this man has the character to understand what he's done and the courage to make it right." The crowd turned to look at Marcus, waiting to see how he would respond to the challenge. The tourist stood there soaked in his own sweat and shame, face to face with a reality he had never been forced to confront before. The moment stretched out like an eternity, with the fate of Marcus's soul hanging in the balance between his pride and his conscience. Everything that happened next would determine not just how the crowd remembered this day, but how Marcus would live with himself for the rest of his life. Marcus stood frozen in the center of the crowd, his face cycling through expressions of shame, anger, and confusion. The water from his earlier prank had long since evaporated in the summer heat, but the stain of his actions seemed to grow deeper with each passing moment. His expensive clothes and confident swagger meant nothing now, stripped away by the raw truth of William's words. Marcus began, his voice cracking. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, searching for sympathy or understanding, but found only disappointment and barely contained anger. Even the children in the crowd seemed to understand that they had witnessed something terrible. William waited patiently, his military bearing restored but somehow more human than before. The water still dripped occasionally from his uniform, each drop a reminder of the humiliation he had endured with dignity and grace. "I didn't know," Marcus finally whispered, the words barely audible above the murmur of the crowd. I thought you were just what?" William asked, his voice gentle now but still carrying an edge of steel. "Just a man in a costume? Just someone put here for your entertainment?" Marcus's hands trembled as he reached up to wipe sweat from his forehead. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him like a wave. He had come to London as a successful businessman, confident in his superiority over what he saw as quaint European traditions. Now he stood exposed as a bully who had attacked a war hero in front of hundreds of witnesses. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, the words coming out in a rush. "I'm really sorry. I was trying to have fun and I didn't think—" "That's the problem," interrupted the elderly veteran who had tried to warn Marcus earlier. "You didn't think. You saw a soldier doing his duty and you decided to torment him for your own amusement." Marcus turned toward the old man, desperate for some way to explain himself. "But I'm American. We support our troops. You would never what?" Mrs. Carter stepped forward, her voice sharp with anger. "You would never humiliate a soldier? Because that's exactly what you just did. My grandson told me about men like Sergeant Hayes, about soldiers who put their lives on the line every day. And you treated him like a toy." The crowd pressed closer, not threateningly, but with the intensity of people who needed to witness something important. Several tourists were still recording, understanding that they were capturing a moment that would be shared around the world. William raised his hand slightly, and the crowd fell silent. "The apology isn't for me," he said quietly. "It's for every soldier who has ever stood guard, who has ever served something larger than himself. It's for the families who have lost loved ones in service to their country. It's for the children who grow up without fathers because good men chose to defend freedom." Marcus felt tears starting to form in his eyes, but he fought them back, clinging to the last shreds of his pride. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to understand," William replied. "I want you to understand that when you mock a soldier, you mock every value that makes civilization possible. Honor, duty, sacrifice, putting others before yourself. These aren't just words, sir. They're the foundation of everything you take for granted." A young girl in the crowd, perhaps 8 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mummy, why did that man pour water on the soldier?" Her mother knelt down to whisper an explanation, but William heard the question and addressed the child directly. "Sometimes, young lady, people do cruel things because they don't understand the difference between what's important and what's just for show. This uniform isn't for show. It represents real people who made real sacrifices." The simplicity of his explanation to the child somehow made Marcus's actions seem even more shameful. If an 8-year-old could understand the significance of respect and honor, what excuse did a grown man have for his behavior? Jake, Marcus's friend, finally found the courage to approach. "Sergeant Hayes," he said formally, "I want to apologize for my friend's behavior. I tried to stop him, but I should have done more. I should have physically prevented him from humiliating you." William nodded respectfully. "You tried to do the right thing, sir. Sometimes that's all any of us can do." The acknowledgement of Jake's attempt to intervene made Marcus feel even more isolated. Even his closest friend was distancing himself from the actions that had seemed so clever just an hour ago. Marcus looked down at his hands, still trembling from his encounter with William's iron grip. Red marks on his wrist served as a physical reminder of the strength that lay beneath the ceremonial uniform. But more than that, they reminded him of the strength of character he had just witnessed, a strength that made his own behavior seem petty and pathetic by comparison. "Sergeant Hayes," Marcus said, his voice stronger now but filled with genuine remorse. "I want to make this right somehow. I know I can't take back what I did, but there has to be something." William studied Marcus's face carefully, looking for signs of genuine change rather than mere embarrassment at being caught. What he saw was a man beginning to confront the reality of his own character, perhaps for the first time in his adult life. "There is something you can do," William said finally. "You can learn from this. You can remember this moment the next time you're tempted to treat someone as less than human because of their job or their position. You can remember that every person you meet has a story, has sacrifices and struggles you know nothing about." The crowd murmured approval, sensing that the confrontation was moving toward something like resolution, but William wasn't finished. "And you can remember the names I've told you today," he continued. "Tommy Morrison, who died for Afghan children he'd never met. David Carter, who survived because good soldiers look out for each other. Remember that when you see soldiers, police officers, firefighters, or anyone else who serves the public, you're looking at people who have chosen to put others before themselves." Marcus nodded, tears now flowing freely down his cheeks. The breakdown of his arrogance was complete, replaced by something that might eventually grow into wisdom. A reporter who had been covering tourist activities at the castle pushed through the crowd with her cameraman. "Sergeant Hayes, I'm Sarah Mitchell from BBC London. Would you be willing to comment on what happened here today?" William considered the request carefully. "I'll speak with you, but not about this gentleman's mistake. I'd rather talk about the soldiers who can't speak for themselves anymore, and the families who sacrifice alongside them." Marcus realized that William was offering him a kind of protection, refusing to make him the center of a media storm that could destroy his life. Even after everything that had happened, the soldier was showing mercy to someone who had shown him none. "Wait," Marcus said suddenly, stepping forward. "I want to say something too." The reporter turned her camera toward him, but Marcus held up his hand. "Not to the media. To Sergeant Hayes." He walked directly up to William, no longer afraid of the soldier's presence but awed by it. Standing as straight as his civilian posture would allow, Marcus looked directly into William's eyes. "Sergeant Hayes, I want you to know that I will never forget this day. I will never forget Tommy Morrison's name or David Carter's or yours. I will never again see a soldier and think of them as anything less than a hero. And if I ever have children, I will tell them this story, and I will make sure they understand what real courage looks like." William extended his hand and Marcus shook it firmly, feeling the same strength that had stopped his cruel prank but now offered in friendship and forgiveness. "That's all any of us can ask for, sir," William said. "The chance to learn from our mistakes and become better than we were." The crowd erupted in applause, moved by the transformation they had witnessed. It wasn't just the humiliation of a bully, but the redemption of a man who had found something better within himself. Mrs. Carter approached the two men, tears streaming down her face. "Sergeant Hayes, my grandson would be so proud to see how you handled this. You honored every soldier who ever served." As the crowd began to disperse, many people approached William to shake his hand, or simply to say thank you. But Marcus stayed behind, watching as the soldier who had changed his life returned gradually to his ceremonial duties. The sun was beginning to set over Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. The day that had begun with cruelty and mockery was ending with understanding and respect. And in the heart of one American tourist, a seed of genuine honor had been planted that would grow for the rest of his life. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson sat in his Chicago office, staring out at the bustling city below. The skyline that had once made him feel powerful and important now seemed hollow somehow. His desk was covered with the usual business reports and financial statements, but his mind kept drifting back to a wet summer afternoon at Windsor Castle. The video of his confrontation with Sergeant Hayes had gone viral within hours of being posted online. At first, Marcus had been mortified, watching millions of people around the world witness his humiliation and transformation. The comments sections were brutal, filled with anger and disgust at his behavior. His company's stock price had even dropped slightly as investors questioned the character of their leadership. But something unexpected had happened in the weeks that followed. Along with the criticism came thousands of messages from people who had been moved by his genuine remorse and William's gracious response. Veterans organizations had reached out not to condemn him, but to thank him for giving them a platform to share their own stories of sacrifice and service. Marcus picked up a letter from his desk, one of hundreds he had received since the incident. This one was from a Gold Star mother in Texas whose son had been killed in Afghanistan. She wrote about watching the video and seeing her own son in Sergeant Hayes, about the dignity with which military families endured their losses, and about forgiveness being more powerful than revenge. His assistant knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Thompson, there's a call for you on line 3. It's from London." Marcus's heart rate increased as he picked up the phone. Over the past few months, he had tried several times to contact Sergeant Hayes through official channels, but military protocol made direct communication difficult. Marcus Thompson speaking. "Mr. Thompson, this is Sergeant William Hayes. I hope I'm not disturbing you." Marcus nearly dropped the phone. "Sergeant Hayes!" "No, not at all. I've been hoping to hear from you. I've tried to reach you several times, but—" "I know," William said, his voice warm but still carrying that unmistakable authority. "I've been following the media coverage of what happened. I wanted to talk to you personally." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Sergeant, I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about what happened. I've been trying to find a way to make amends, to do something meaningful." "Actually, that's why I'm calling," William interrupted gently. "I have a proposition for you." Over the next hour, William explained that he had been contacted by several military charities who wanted to work with Marcus to turn his experience into something positive. There was a veterans transition program that helped soldiers adjust to civilian life, a support group for Gold Star families, and a scholarship fund for children of fallen service members. "They don't want your money, Mr. Thompson," William explained. "They want your story. They want you to speak to business leaders, to schools, to anyone who will listen about what you learned that day, about the importance of respect, of understanding sacrifice, of seeing the humanity in everyone you meet." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, overwhelmed by the opportunity to transform his greatest shame into something useful. Would you be willing to work with me on this? I know I have no right to ask, but I think the message would be more powerful coming from both of us." "I was hoping you'd ask," William replied. "I've already been given permission to participate, as long as it's done properly and respectfully." 2 weeks later, Marcus found himself standing backstage at a veterans conference in Washington, D.C., more nervous than he had ever been in his life. Through a gap in the curtain, he could see hundreds of veterans, active-duty military personnel, and their families filling the auditorium. William appeared beside him, looking impressive in his dress uniform, but somehow more approachable than he had been at Windsor Castle. "Ready for this?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I know it's important." They walked onto the stage together, an unlikely pair united by a moment of crisis that had changed both their lives. The audience fell silent as they recognized the two men from the viral video that had touched millions of hearts around the world. Marcus stepped up to the microphone first, his hands shaking slightly. 3 months ago, I was a successful businessman who thought he understood the world. I thought respect was something you earned through money and power. I thought soldiers were just people in costumes put there for my entertainment." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces before him. In the front row, he spotted Mrs. Carter, who had flown in from London specifically to attend the event. Her presence gave him strength to continue. "I was wrong about everything," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger. "On a summer day at Windsor Castle, I learned what real strength looks like. I learned what real courage means. And I learned that the most powerful thing in the world isn't the ability to humiliate someone weaker than you, but the ability to show mercy to someone who doesn't deserve it." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Marcus could see tears in many eyes, veterans and family members who recognized their own experiences in his story. William stepped up to share the microphone. "What Mr. Thompson did that day was wrong," he said simply. "But what he did afterwards was right. He chose to learn, to grow, to become better than he was. That's all any of us can do with our mistakes." Together, they told the complete story of that day. Not just the confrontation, but the reconciliation that followed. They spoke about the importance of seeing past uniforms and job titles to the human beings underneath. They talked about the families who sacrifice alongside their military members, the communities that support them, and the responsibility that civilians have to understand and honor that service. When they finished, the audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted for several minutes. But more importantly, people began coming forward to share their own stories, to talk about their experiences with disrespect and dignity, with failure and redemption. An elderly veteran approached Marcus after the presentation, his World War II ribbons catching the light. "Son," he said, gripping Marcus's hand firmly, "I've been waiting 70 years to hear someone say what you said today. Thank you for having the courage to admit you were wrong and the wisdom to make it right." As the evening wound down, Marcus and William found themselves alone on the hotel balcony, looking out at the monuments of the nation's capital. The Washington Monument stood tall in the distance, a stark reminder of the sacrifices that had built and preserved the country they both loved. "Do you think we're making a difference?" Marcus asked. William was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully. "I think we're planting seeds," he said finally. "Some will grow, some won't. But every person who hears our story and chooses respect over mockery, understanding over ignorance, that's a victory worth fighting for." Marcus nodded, feeling a sense of purpose he had never experienced in all his years of business success. The man who had once mocked a soldier's sacrifice had become an advocate for military families, transformed by grace into something he never thought he could be. 1 year after the incident at Windsor Castle, Marcus Thompson stood once again on British soil, but this time his purpose was entirely different. He walked through the gates of the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst, invited to speak to young officer candidates about leadership, respect, and the power of second chances. The Academy's ancient buildings carried the weight of centuries of military tradition. These halls had trained leaders who had served in every major conflict, who had led men and women into battle with courage and honor. Marcus felt the significance of being allowed to speak in such a place, knowing that his words would reach future commanders who would shape the military for decades to come. Sergeant William Hayes met him at the entrance, now promoted and serving as an instructor at the academy. The year had been good to William, who had channeled his experience into helping train the next generation of soldiers. His work with Marcus had opened doors to new opportunities, allowing him to share his combat experience in ways that went beyond traditional military instruction. "Nervous?" William asked as they walked toward the lecture hall. Marcus smiled, no longer the arrogant businessman who had stepped off a tour bus 12 months earlier. "Always, but it's a good kind of nervous now, the kind that comes from knowing you're doing something important." The lecture hall was filled with young men and women, future lieutenants and captains who would one day lead soldiers into harm's way. Their faces showed the intense focus that came from understanding the gravity of their chosen profession. These weren't college students playing at being soldiers. They were individuals who had committed their lives to service before they had even begun their careers. Marcus took his place behind the podium, looking out at the audience that would have intimidated him beyond measure just a year ago. Now he felt honored to share his story with people who represented the best of human character. "A year ago," he began, "I stood in front of one of your fellow soldiers and demonstrated everything that's wrong with the world today. I showed disrespect, cruelty, and ignorance. I treated a war hero like a tourist attraction, and I nearly destroyed my own soul in the process." The cadets listened intently, many having already seen the viral video that had sparked global conversations about respect and dignity. But hearing the story directly from Marcus gave it a different power, a more personal impact. "Today I want to talk to you about something more important than my mistakes," Marcus continued. "I want to talk about the character of the man who forgave me, and what that teaches us about true leadership." He went on to describe William's response to the humiliation, not just the moment of confrontation, but the grace and mercy that followed. He talked about how real strength wasn't the ability to destroy an enemy, but the wisdom to transform one into an ally. William then took the podium, sharing insights about leadership under pressure, about maintaining dignity in the face of provocation, and about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. His words carried the weight of real experience, earned through years of service and sacrifice. "The ultimate test of a leader," William told the cadets, "isn't how you handle success or even how you face the enemy. It's how you treat those who are completely at your mercy, who can't fight back, who are dependent on your character for their dignity." After the presentation, the cadets asked dozens of questions, probing deeper into the lessons that could be learned from the unlikely friendship between a former bully and his victim. One young woman raised her hand and asked the question that everyone was thinking. "Sir, how do you know when someone truly deserves forgiveness? How do you tell the difference between genuine change and someone who's just sorry they got caught?" William considered the question carefully before answering. "You watch their actions when no one is forcing them to act. Mr. Thompson could have disappeared after our confrontation, could have tried to forget it ever happened. Instead, he chose to make it the defining moment of his life, to build something positive from something shameful." Marcus nodded, understanding that he was living proof of William's philosophy. "I can't undo what I did," he added, "but I can spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the forgiveness I was given." Later that evening, Marcus and William attended a formal dinner with Academy staff and distinguished guests. Among them was Mrs. Carter, now a regular supporter of military charities, and Jake, Marcus's friend who had become an advocate for veterans' causes in his own right. The conversation around the dinner table was warm and meaningful, touching on topics that ranged from military history to the challenges facing modern society. Marcus found himself able to contribute meaningfully to discussions that would have been far beyond his understanding just a year earlier. As the evening wound down, Marcus and William found themselves walking through the Academy grounds under a canopy of stars. The same moon that had shone down on battlefields throughout history now illuminated their path as two men who had found friendship in the most unlikely circumstances. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked suddenly. "Showing me mercy instead of letting security drag me away? Your life would have been simpler if you'd just let me face the consequences alone." William stopped walking and turned to face his friend. "Marcus, what happened that day wasn't just about you learning something. I learned something too. I learned that the mission doesn't end when the shooting stops. Sometimes the most important battles are fought with words and grace instead of weapons." They reached a memorial wall listing the names of Academy graduates who had died in service to their country. Both men stood in respectful silence, reading the names of young officers who had given their lives for ideals larger than themselves. "Tommy Morrison," William said quietly, pointing to a name carved in the stone. "He graduated from here 10 years ago." Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes as he read the name of the soldier, whose sacrifice had been part of his awakening at Windsor Castle. Tommy Morrison wasn't just a story anymore. He was a real person whose life had meaning and whose death had purpose. "I want to visit his family," Marcus said. "I want them to know that his sacrifice changed someone, that his memory is making the world a little bit better." William smiled, recognizing the completion of Marcus's transformation. "I think Tommy would like that. I think he'd be proud that his story helped save someone else." As they walked back toward the main building, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. A year ago, he had been a successful but hollow man, measuring his worth by his bank account and his ability to dominate others. Tonight, he was walking with a true hero through the grounds of an institution dedicated to service and sacrifice. The Marcus Thompson who had poured water on a soldier's head was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real success came not from what you could take from the world, but from what you could give to it. And in that transformation, both he and William had found something more valuable than either had expected. A friendship forged in the crucible of crisis and tempered by the strength of forgiveness. The story that had begun with cruelty and mockery had become a testament to the power of redemption, proving that even the darkest moments could become the foundation for something beautiful. In the end, both men had learned that the greatest victory wasn't defeating an enemy, but helping that enemy become a friend. As they reached the Academy's main entrance, Marcus turned for one last look at the memorial wall, silently promising Tommy Morrison and all the others that their sacrifices would not be forgotten, that their legacy would live on in the changed heart of a man who had learned to honor what he had once mocked. The circle was complete, and the real story was just beginning.